Hey, fourth graders, welcome back to Math Time. Yesterday we did talk a little bit about decimals and the fact that after the decimal we have the tenths place value and we also have the hundredths place value. If I were to stick a 3 underneath the tenths, I would say that this is 3 tenths. Okay? If I were to move that 3 over to the hundredths place, I would say that I have 3 hundredths because I would have 0 tenths and I would have 3 hundredths. Okay, but if I were to take this 0 off here, and if I were to put another 3, for example, here, now I just simply read it as I would normally read a number, and I would call this 33, right? 33 hundredths. Now again, I'm not going to say the tenths, because it would be like saying we have 3 tenths and 3 hundredths, in which case if we have 3 tenths plus 3 hundredths, then we would have 33 hundredths. Okay, what we're going to be looking at today is we are going to be taking these decimals and we are going to be going back to fractions. I know we just have been talking about fractions recently, but we're going to be now converting our decimals to fractions and our fractions to decimals. Okay, so if I show you this problem here, I have 0.8. Now in order to convert 0.8 into a fraction, you need to think about how what we call this number. How do we read this number? Well, if I put an 8 up here a second here, I notice that here I have my 8 is right next to the decimal, just like my 8 is right next to the decimal here. I know that this is 8 tenths. So I would read this number as 8 tenths. Now the really cool thing about converting a decimal to a fraction is you just write down the fraction of what it sounds like. So I would call this 8 tenths. So my fraction for this would be 8 over 10. It would be 8 tenths. Okay? But what if I have this one down here? If I have 0.68. Well, again, how do I read this decimal? Let me put my numbers up here a second. I notice that I have a decimal and then a 6 and an 8. So up here I have a decimal, a 6 and an 8. I know that I read this as 68 hundredths. Okay? So I would read this decimal as 68 hundredths. And the way that I'm going to write this fraction is I'm going to write it just as I read it here. Okay? 68 hundredths. All right? So notice if I have one digit right next to the decimal, my denominator is 10 because I have 8 tenths. If I have two digits, both my tenths and my hundredths place values are being used here. My 0.68 is my numerator here, but it's just 68 over 100 because I have 68 hundredths. Okay, that's kind of cool that you can just write it down as you read it. But what if we go from a fraction to a decimal? Well, here I have the fraction of 2 tenths. I'm going to get my numbers off of here a second. If I have a fraction of 2 tenths, well, I know that I can just write it down as I read it. 2 tenths. If I put a 2 right underneath my tenths place value here, well, that would be 2 tenths. And I would notice that it's right next to my decimal, so I would write down 0.2. 2 tenths equals 0.2. What about 33 over 100? How would I write that one as a decimal? Well, 33 hundredths, 33 over 100. I just need to write it down, my decimal down as I read it. 33 hundredths. Well, let me put it up here a second. 33 hundredths, right? Just as I read my fraction here, 33 hundredths. Decimal 3, 3. All right? So that's how I convert a fraction to a decimal. Again, just like converting a decimal to a fraction, I write it down just as I read it. 2 tenths. Well, I know that if I have a decimal and a 2, the 2 is going to be in the tenths place, so 2 tenths. If I have 33 hundredths, I know that I need both my tenths and my hundredths digit to be used here. And I would just simply read this decimal as 33 hundredths, right? Now, there are a couple tricky ones here. Let me get these off here a second. What if I have 0.06. Let me put these ones up here a second. 0.06. How would I convert this decimal, 0.06, how could I convert that into a fraction? It's not 6 over 10, because I know that this is not 6/10 here. This is 6/100ths, okay? Since my hundredths place value is being used, and my 0 is just telling me simply that I have 0/10. I don't have any tenths, but I do have 6/100ths. Well, again, I just write it down as I read it as 6/100ths. So I put a 6 over 100. 6/100ths. Okay? What if we have a fraction such as, let's do 8 over 100 here. If I have 8 over 100, how could I write that one down as a decimal? Well, I know here that I could technically call this fraction 8/100ths. So simply, let me get the 8/100ths up there a second. I do need my 0, and my 0 just fell all the way down on the ground. So let's pretend that there is a 0 right up here. Okay? I'm going to grab it for you guys a second, just to show you. If I have my 0 and my 8, I would call this 8/100ths. Okay? That's exactly what my fraction looks like there. 8/100ths. So I'm going to do 0.08. The important thing here is remembering the 0 in between the decimal and your hundredths place value to represent that there are 0/10ths. Okay? And then with the fractions, your important thing here is to remember that your denominator is going to be 100. All right, well, that does wrap up our lesson for today. If you guys have any questions, let me know. This is tricky stuff, so feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you might have. But as always, remember to wash your hands. See you later, guys.